Hello, this is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center. I'm delighted to be here today with Irene Lyon. I've been following her work for a long time, and she has an approach to the nervous system and healing. It's very practical, very deep. And I'd like to just start. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, the training you've had, and your approach?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Lynn. It's a longer story, so I'll do little snippets of it. But I originally got into the healing worlds out of one of my own injuries. I was in high school, ski racing, and tore a very critical ligament in the knee called the ACL, which is very common in skiers, especially females. And I got interested in just the rehabilitation, the physical therapy, and all of that. Which at the time, it was in 1992, things were still quite primitive in that area. But I recovered and got interested and needed to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, whatever that might mean. And I decided to keep studying the human body, human performance, and went into something that we call here, at least in Canada, kinesiology, which is the study of human movement and science and exercise. In some places like the UK, I don't know if you know this, in Australia, kinesiology is more energy medicine. So it's interesting. I just put that out there because it's more about the science and structure of the body. So I got into that, loved it, and got into fitness and nutrition. Had the fortune of working with athletes from all over the spectrum, from Olympic to wheelchair to general population, people with back pain, people with chronic pain. And as I started to get deeper into my work with fitness, I was not recovering myself. So I had a few other injuries, all sport related. That was my addiction, was a high adrenaline, like hanging from 10,000 feet in a paraglider and steep cliffs and all that kind of stuff. So that was my 20s, and I kept injuring myself. And what I found, which is really, I think, beautiful for our conversation about healing methods and alternative things, is what I had been taught in university really well, I might add, wasn't helping me recover. So even though I could, hey puppy, so even though I couldn't, even though I was working with people recovering their physical injuries, helping them rehab, what I had been taught wasn't helping me, if that makes sense. And I'm like, holy cow, I just spent 7 years in university. My parents put me through this amazing schooling. And I've had about, at that point, about 5 knee surgeries, a patella fracture. Like it was pretty bad. And I was just crooked. And even though I was fit, I was in a lot of physical pain, a lot of tension, and all the things I was supposed to do, but I still wasn't better. So that got me into just searching for something else, which I think when we are kind of at that end and we are like, is there anything else? I hope people keep asking questions and searching and learning. And so I was lucky to have a physical therapist that said, you might want to try something called Feldenkrais. So I'll say that slowly one more time, Feldenkrais, which is the name of a person who back in the 60s and 70s was really the first person that we know of to think and know that the system, the human system, can change. Even though at that point we thought that if there was a brain injury or some kind of paralysis, that was it. A person was screwed for the rest of their life. Even with things like heart attack, back in
Mhm.
the day, if someone did survive, it's like, well, you got to take it easy. You can't
Right.
push yourself. And
Mhm.
now we know that that's actually the opposite. Like within reason, we've got to push the system. We have to challenge it. So Dr. Feldenkrais was someone that saw injuries. He himself had been injured really badly, and he experimented with movement. He studied baby development, of all things. He was a highly trained martial artist, so judo was his skill. And he was also a nuclear physicist. So he was an engineer studying like high level science. He worked with the Curies in Paris at the Sorbonne when they were developing nuclear energy, all these crazy things. And so he was actually one of the people that helped develop the atomic bomb. Not that that's a good thing to be known for, but he was high up there with his thinking, and he saw the human system in that complexity. So I got into this work, the Feldenkrais work, in my early 20s, and it completely changed everything. It might seem a little miraculous, but after about 4 weeks of doing just that work, learning movements, repatterning my body, understanding how, even though I understood anatomy and muscles, I didn't understand the function of the body in relationship to the environment. So often in physical therapy, we just look at the muscle, stretch the muscle, strengthen the muscle, tighten our core, all these things, but we don't relearn how to move with the ground. And if we think about babies, when they learn, they don't think, I'm going to contract my bicep to pick up that toy. They're not thinking that. And so he was like, how can we go back to the basics? But what is basic in that way is actually quite complex. So back to there, I like, well, I have to learn the Feldenkrais work. I did that for 4 years, completely changed my outlook. And then I started practicing, had a really successful practice in Whistler, British Columbia, working with lots of folks. And about 50% of the people I saw were getting really good benefits the way I had. And then the other 50% weren't. And then, of course, the other question mark comes in, which is, well, what the heck am I missing now? And so I started to ask questions. And what I started to see was that the people that weren't getting better with this sophisticated form of mind, body, environment, movement, repatterning were people that had had lots of trauma. So lots of accidents, more than mine in a sense. They were brought up in environments that weren't safe. So abuse, just things were not safe. They may have had injuries that were quite devastating throughout their life, physical abuse, sexual abuse. One woman I'm remembering was in a propane explosion. So she was recovering from burns. So the trauma was different there. And so I asked questions and like, what am I missing? It was the piece about the nervous system and trauma. Even though the Feldenkrais work is about the nervous system, it's at that higher level. Whereas what I was missing was the real deep autonomic, unconscious survival elements. So I then went back to school and studied something called Somatic Experiencing, which is the work of Dr. Peter Levine, which many people know of. And that completely just blew my mind and opened my eyes to the next layer of the human system, which was or is the autonomic nervous system and how it connects to everything. Studied that, got into practice, started to do a lot of good stuff. And then there was another piece that was missing, and that was looking at the earlier pieces of trauma. So a lot of people don't know this, but Peter's work was originally developed more around shock trauma. I don't know if you know the distinction there, Lynn, but
It would be good to explain it for people.
yeah.
Mm.
So, and they kind of mesh together, but shock trauma is something that occurs to us when we are older. And by older, I mean like 5 years old forward, where we have a little more memory and where there's like a specific shock to the system, like falling off of your bike and breaking an arm, or being in a car accident, or even a natural disaster, or even physical abuse or sexual abuse. Those would be considered shock traumas. What was missing from my studies with Peter in the SE community was what occurs when it isn't something like a shock, when it's more early, when it's more developmental, when it's in utero, because we even know now that a fetus, a developing human, is impacted in utero by what's happening to mom in her day-to-day life. We even know that generational trauma is real and it gets passed through the DNA. So I'm like, oh my goodness, there's another piece. And it all came down to people that were brought up in circumstances that it wasn't about necessarily shocks. It could have been, but their environment just was never safe. There was maybe abuse, but maybe mom and dad didn't like each other. Maybe there was divorce. Maybe there was real hardness. There was food on the table, but to get that food there was very stressful, that kind of stuff. And the little people, I call them little people, the kids, they feel it. They sense in the field something's not right. They know that everything looks good, but they sense a stress, and it's chronic. And that kind of chronic low level stress we would classify as early or developmental trauma. There's also birth trauma and surgical trauma, anesthesia trauma. I say those because a lot of people who are struggling as adults, they actually might be like, you know what? I had a good upbringing. I had a good childhood. My parents actually really did like each other, and we weren't put into these horrible situations. But then you get into history, it's like, oh, you were born premature. Oh, you had a really scary surgery when you were young. Dental work, all this stuff, goes into this big pot. So I got into the work after studying somatic experiencing in Peter's world with another teacher, another faculty member within the SE community. Her name is Kathy Kain. Her co-teacher, her other colleague is Steve Terrell. And they have really developed a form of work to work at that really deep, deep early level, which has kind of completed, in a way, the trifecta of my learning, which started with the Feldenkrais work, obviously my studies in human science, the SE work, which is more the shock trauma, that, and then the last thing is this sort of early developmental piece that we know creates what we call dysregulation in the nervous system. So that is my long-winded way of saying this is how I got into the work. And I mean, we're always learning. There's always little pieces that come in, but so far what I've seen is those three pieces together form a really solid whole for working with people who have all sorts of things going on in their lives.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm. So maybe you could start with a story or two about
Mhm.
people who've come in, just kind of some typical, because what you're talking about with some of your courses
Yeah.
are really talking about healing the nervous system at such a
Yeah.
deep level.
Yep.
What would
There's
that look
so
like
many
for someone
stories.
with?
Yeah. It
Yeah.
depends if you want a story that's more based on um, a general overall or something where there's more like a specific. I mean, there's so many stories. So I'm like, which one do
Well,
I
let's go with
pick?
one of each. Let's go with one of each.
Okay. Well, if I think about, I'll actually use my husband as an example, because he's one that I've been given permission to talk about freely. Um, his name is Seth. He also does what I do now. But when I met him about 9 years ago, he was into healing and the mind, body, and meditation, which I know you are practicing. But he had no clue about this underlying nervous system piece. And he grew up in that good household, Silicon Valley, high level parents, lots of money, food on the table, and there was divorce. There was a lot of unresolved trauma in his parents. There was physical abuse in the form of, lots of spanking and shame from his parents. I won't name which, but there was also mental illness with the parents. Um, and it was just not a safe situation. Um, he had a brother that died really young. So, parents lose a child. It was not good and they weren't processing stuff. And so he, as all humans are, being sensitive and attuned, just started to slowly shut down and disconnect. He started to use food as a way to cope. As he got older, he used pornography as another way to cope, which is a huge problem right now in our society. And with these stressors and this early trauma, he was also born premature. So he had that going against him too. And he wasn't brought into a family that valued healthy eating and lots of exercise. So sometimes really healthy eating and being active can help inoculate us a little bit for a certain period of time, not forever, but when we're younger. So he had none of that. And so he was just kind of a mess when I met him, although still had life in him because we fell in love. But, his body was broken physically. He was got a lot of pain. He was overweight, still dealing with a lot of these addictions, but knowing I need to change this. I think one of the things that saved him was he didn't buy into the classic way. I got to get a house. I've got to get a career. I got to follow what my parents did. He kind of said, screw you to the society. And he actually went to Hawaii to just be a monk and meditate, literally. So he went with no possessions, nothing. He was really young then. He was in his 20s. And did a lot of healing, but didn't heal completely. Still searching, had a son there with a woman. His son is still healthy and great. But there were these elements because of his upbringing where he had trouble parenting. He didn't know how to discipline because his disciplining was so off the charts bad
Right.
that it's like, I don't know how to do this, so I'm just not going to do anything. Right. And so things swung the other direction.
Mhm.
So fast forward to when we met, which was about 9 years ago, there was kind of a deal breaker. It's like, well, if we're going to hang out, you got to work on this stuff. And he was interested in what I did. So long story short, he ended up becoming a somatic experiencing practitioner in the last 9 years. He ended up studying not only Peter Levine's work, but the early developmental trauma work that I mentioned, which is Kathy Kain's and Stephen Terrell's. He has a thriving practice. He's boxing twice a week. He's strong. His addictions are pretty much completely gone. And it took time. Like it took a lot of personal work, a lot of one-on-one work, a lot of relational work with me, rebuilding the safety map. So by that I mean if you were brought up where the world was a dangerous place and people watching this who are struggling with addiction, most likely this was the case. We know this now. If the world wasn't safe, I couldn't be myself. I couldn't get my emotions out and express. Wasn't safe to say I hate you, I don't want to do that. Like you just had to bottle it all up. That will infect the body. It'll create toxicity in the system. And even though even till last year, all the behaviors were in place, so the healthy eating, the addictive behaviors were shifted, exercise was there, self-confidence was there. There was still this deep cellular unsafety. And it got better and better over time. And even though we're in this house, I'm in my house right now, and he knows theoretically I am safe. And even heart, he knows my heart is with you. There was this deep, things are not safe, but over time and time, this past summer, something dropped, something finally, boom. And for the first time ever, he was able to actually fall asleep with me walking around upstairs because our bedroom is under the main floor.
Mhm.
Any little creak would startle, like,
Right. Yeah.
right? And he just fell asleep one night with me roaming around doing what I do because I'm a night owl. And it literally, and it sounds so crazy because he's 40, almost 46. That was the first time that he actually felt settled at home because home was always unsafe.
Right.
So
Mhm.
some people might be like, my God, that took 9 years, right? But here's the thing, it wasn't just one day and the next. That safety was slowly building, getting safer or less dangerous and safer and less dangerous. And this is where couples, for example, if they know their partner has a history like this, and you want to stick with them, there needs to be that slow, we would call it titrated in Peter Levine's work,
Mhm.
approach where you're rebuilding and you are literally creating a map that has never been done before for this person. They didn't have that solid attachment, that secure attachment, that attunement, that ability to express when they were young. It never got built. And a lot of people talk about rewiring, the nervous system. Well, the difference with this kind of early trauma, I'm going to use my hand. So for those just listening to this, what I'm doing because I'm dangling my hands. Rather than rewiring, there's wires that were never actually put together.
Right. So it's
Does
a
that make
connection
sense?
process. Mhm.
So when the safety map wasn't written because our early experiences were so scary, it's not that we're rewiring something necessarily. We might rewire the behaviors of I've got to exercise, I have to eat better, I'm feeling that urge to eat that food, have that drink, click on that website. That might be the rewiring. But what drives that behavior is that early wiring of safety and self-regulation and connection that never got it never got wired.
Right,
And
right.
so the story I just shared is the process of how to create that wiring and rewrite that safety map over time. So that is an interesting story because it shows the complexity. It isn't, and it requires not just solo work, but it requires being in relationship, whether that's with a partner, a friend, a therapist, a group,
Mhm.
um, any way that a person can interact. There needs to be some form of what we would call co-regulation. Pets are great for that as well as a starting point, because if that co-regulation wasn't there, every time a person goes out into the world and they're interacting with someone, maybe they do really good work at home, but then they're out and something throws them off, and then it just
Mhm.
gets it gets unwired.
Mhm.
So we need to have that interaction when our early wounds were relational. If that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah. It's something that, I think most people didn't really get until very recently, even
Mhm.
5, 10 years ago, was how important neglect and emotional neglect is.
Mhm.
And just the kind of ordinary misattunement, not being seen,
Yes.
my emotions aren't okay, that kind of environment. And then
Yes.
children tend to really feel unsafe. And what you're talking about with your
Mhm.
husband is a long period of time of safe experiences that
Yep.
gradually allowed him. And then there would be some unsafe thing, I'm sure, and it would be like, oh no, I was
Of
right,
course.
it's not safe. And
Yeah.
then yeah, it takes a while to do that.
It's the consistency,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
And that's where it is tricky. It's the
mhm,
same with raising kids. If the parents, for example, or the parent in the school system aren't in the same looking in the same direction, that
mhm,
little nervous system is like confused.
mhm,
Well, who am I supposed to connect to? Who's right? Because they're looking for right and wrong, right?
mhm,
They're not looking for a choice. And
mm,
what I've seen is a lot of anxiety, a lot of we would classify it as mental illness in kids, but it's really physiological dysregulation.
mm,
It's because no one is giving them a pure map of right from wrong and boundaries and routines. We also need expression and play, obviously, but when there isn't that container, they don't know how to go out and express, how to emote, because they don't know what's going to happen if they do. Because the after effect or the fallout, I like to use the word, it's like this nuclear fallout. It's like, well, if I do this, I might get punished, or I might be told to go to my room, or oh, I can do this expression here, but I can't do it here. And at that young level, which is where a lot of this stuff starts, it poses a bit of a conundrum for the small, immature nervous system. And then often what occurs is that system, that human starts to shut down,
mhm,
or they start to become a menace. It usually goes one of two ways.
mhm,
Typically, because humans are smart and they want to survive, they'll shut down because that is actually safer.
right.
However, for the physiology, it requires more energy to shut down. And then that's where we do get things like addiction, risky behavior, because we're
Mhm,
trying to pull ourselves out of that shutdown response.
mhm,
Because it doesn't feel good to be numb. So we're trying to find a way to get out of that numb, but then we do it in ways that aren't really useful or helpful for our systems.
Mhm.
That makes sense.
So when we're talking about becoming a menace, um,
Yeah.
and that wasn't me. I was very much shut down. I had
Yeah.
no idea I was shut down until
No, neither did
many
I.
years later. Yeah. So and I going, wow, I kind of missed that couple of decades there.
Mhm.
But if we're talking about becoming a menace, and I want to circle back to something you were talking about, safety.
Yeah.
We kind of become a menace to ourselves. We have, a
Yes.
mean inner critic. We have a lack of compassion. Can you
Mhm.
speak to that a little bit in terms of being safe for ourselves?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And to go back to what you said, this is so common in our
Mhm,
culture,
mhm, mhm,
right? It's almost like we're in something so deep that we don't even realize that this isn't how it's supposed to be.
mhm,
I always go back to the movie The Matrix, which is
mhm,
over 20 years old now, I think. That movie was way ahead of its time, and it really depicted what we don't see is around us or within us. And so I'm kind of making this normal for everyone listening, because most of us living in this world, if you have access to this computer and you have running water and a toilet that flushes, chances are there's some level of conditioning, cultural conditioning, societal conditioning, religious conditioning, industrial conditioning, that we're not even aware of, right?
mhm,
I'll give one example and then I'll come back to the menace thing. Is we're taught as kids, if we're biologically letting things out like gas or burping or sneezing, you say excuse me, pardon me, you leave the room. It's like this shame of these responses, and
mhm,
yet you go to other cultures and it just gets let out, because
mhm.
why would you excuse your body actually doing what it wants to do?
Right.
So that British rule of properness, and children are meant to be seen and not heard, and that stiff upper lip that keeps in all the anger and the tears, like that's completely false for a human organism. It's culture, it's society, and so we're in this weird transition, I think. And we know this because people are wanting to get anger out and cry, and it's being done in a kind of unrefined way, but at least it's happening. Whereas I know when I was little, my parents weren't having web interviews like this,
Right.
right? We weren't talking about it. So I give that as a little bit of a hope, like we're actually
Mhm,
moving in the right direction. It
mhm,
just seems really messy right now because there isn't a law or a rule that's like, actually, we all are supposed to do this, just
mhm,
like we're all supposed to brush our teeth
mhm,
at night and in the morning. So the menace thing is interesting. This is another story actually that might serve well for
mhm,
parents that have kiddos that are menaces. I'm thinking about a woman that I worked with ages ago, who came in with chronic pain, and um, was in a car accident that was not excruciatingly bad. It was just a little bit of a bump. Um, and her system just unraveled. It was fine before that. I say that with air quotes, fine. But then she ended up getting anxious, phobias, horrific chronic pain, was being put on meds, and we know where that can lead. And as we started to work together, and unfortunately, she was in the insurance system, which is not really that great. She wasn't getting the proper care. Luckily, she saw me, um, and we started to feel into the history. And she was the good kid in the family. Like the family didn't have a lot of money. There was abuse. Um, and her sibling was the one that wasn't the good kid, that was the rebel rouser, the one that went out at night not telling mom, like all that sort of stuff, like the opposite of introvert and quiet, and making sure the house, this client of mine made sure the house was clean and made sure the bills were paid at like age 10, like stuff that kids shouldn't at that age shouldn't do. And so she was keeping all this in, Whereas the sibling who said, screw you, I'm just going to go, similar to my husband in some ways, um, didn't have any troubles with anxiety, and like they were fine. I'm sure that there was other stuff within that. So there's something to be said about a kid that has that spunk versus the kid that is so good and quiet. Because I know we want our kids to be good and quiet, but there's a point at which that can actually show that they're in a bit of shutdown, right? So why am I saying that? We want to have this healthy, I'm using my hand to show this flow between up and down, right? And that's how the nervous system wants to work. It wants to have these cycles of what we would call activation, having energy. And then we also want it to know that it can come down and rest. And folks stuck in these elements of dysregulation, whether it's being numbed and shut down, they won't feel these natural waves, these natural ups and downs. And by ups, I don't mean manic and depressed. I mean just I'm up in the morning, I've got energy to do what I need to do. And then, oh, it's getting dark, I better calm down and go to sleep. And we know when folks have troubles with their nervous system, the opposite can happen. They can feel horribly lethargic all day. And then as soon as the sun goes down, they get their second wind and they go to sleep and they can't sleep at night, which is super common. And that's a sign of the nervous system being this weird flux that is actually opposite to how it's supposed to work. So I don't know
Right.
if I answered your question. Kind of went off a little story there about the menaced child.
Mhm.
But let me know if there's any follow-ups from that.
Well, there's two. So one is, why don't we just talk about sleep for a minute,
Mm-hmm.
and fear and anxiety. So some people have trouble going to sleep,
Yep.
and it seems like it's not safe to be in bed, which is often for good reason, right?
Yep.
Um, and then there's some people who wake up in the morning full of fear.
Mm-hmm.
What have you seen around that?
It's not cut and dry. It's complex.
Hmm.
It can be completely related to that early picture I painted, which is the world isn't safe, the house isn't safe, I need to be on guard. When we go to sleep at night and we get good restorative sleep, we are essentially allowing ourselves to be unconscious in a sense, right? And so if I use again my husband as that example, when he was still living in that sort of survival energy, any little creak up, right? Which
Hmm.
has a purpose if
Right.
there really is a threat, right? And so, if we're in the jungle as, you know, wild creatures living, we want to hear that creak in
Hmm.
case it's a predator coming to get our young,
Right.
right? Or, or our food if cavemen days. So
Hmm.
we need that. And this is where I'll bring in a fancy word. The word is neuroception. I don't know if do you know that word? So
Yep.
it's a word that Stephen Porges coined, and Stephen Porges is the one who uncovered the complexities of the vagus nerve, so the polyvagal theory. And so neuroception is our perception of either danger or safety. It goes both ways. So neuroception. So when we are sleeping at night, I'll tell the audience what we want. So we want to go to sleep, preferably not in a way where we completely pass out, like like we're being put under anesthesia. I'll say why
Yep.
that's not good. We want to lull to sleep and then sleep through the night. If we have to get up and pee, we do it. Our body says, get up, you're going to go, you got to go pee. We go, we come back to bed, we just go back to sleep. When people are in really deep out to lunch sleep, they might wet their beds, even as adults. They
Hmm.
might not know what's going on. They may sleepwalk. I mean, there's all sorts of sleep conditions.
Hmm.
When we're sleeping in a restorative way, we're in, and I won't get into all the REM cycles and brain waves. That's for me not as important as we want the vagus nerve to be, I'll use a fancy term, we want the vagus nerve to be in the gear of something called low tone dorsal. Are you familiar with that?
Mhm.
Good. So low tone dorsal is a I like to say gear. It's like a gear in cars, first because it's still the same engine, it's just in a different gear. So it's the same
Fair.
nerve of the
Mhm.
parasympathetic, but it's in this low tone. It's like neutral, but it's neutral revving really low. And so when we're in low tone dorsal of the parasympathetic, we're in what's called true rest digest. True rest digest means that the immune system is repairing, it's searching for viruses and bacteria and cancer cells and things and destroying them. Our gut is repairing, so the
Mhm.
gut lining is being stitched back up, and the cells are repairing. Waste products are being excreted. Low tone dorsal is repair and rest and repair, rest, digest. That's what we go into when we have really good nervous system regulation, when we don't have a lot of survival, stress, and trauma trapped in our system. When we get that repair, we wake up in the morning easy, refreshed. The cold that we felt we were fighting the day before might be gone. That little
Mhm.
bit of inflammation might be gone. We'd have our eyes are nice and white rather than bloodshot. All these things are going well. When we are living in a state of dysregulation, and there's this fear that's not needed, because we need good fear when we are in trouble, but it's
Mhm.
this fear that's there 24/7. When we go to sleep, we can go into what's called it's called high tone of the dorsal, and that's deep shutdown. That's the shutdown of the parasympathetic that we go into if we're in shock, if
Mhm.
we're in a really dangerous situation and we just like cut out. So if
Mhm.
someone faints, for example, because they see something they don't like or their blood pressure doesn't do what it's supposed to, that's the system going into this deep metabolic freeze, high tone dorsal of the parasympathetic. Many people who are still living with untreated trauma, when they go to sleep, they go into that high tone. And so it's like they're dead to the world.
Ah.
And so they're sleeping, but that repair of the digestion, the immune system, the refreshing of the vessels isn't happening. And so we feel horrible in the morning. We feel heavy. We feel lethargic. And the body hasn't had a chance to clean up, essentially. And then what do we do in our culture? We have to have coffee, things to get us going,
Mhm.
right? We might have to go do something adrenalized, like be crazy at our workouts to get things going, because the body will adjust.
Mhm.
The other flip side is some are like, well, I certainly don't sleep, I'm just awake. That's along the spectrum of the system saying, again, danger, danger, danger. Or
Mhm.
maybe you go to sleep a little and then you're up and then the heart's pounding and beating and beating. Or the other common thing, and you said that, is you go into this deep sleep, you're in kind of in this deep shock, high tone dorsal. You wake up because maybe it's your alarm, or maybe the system's like, that's enough, and it pops you out. And so when people say I wake up and I'm just like this, it's because the system, it's like the car is being driven erratically. If I
Mhm.
use, you use that gear, you teach someone how to use a clutch for the first time, it's like poof, right? They're popping it out. They don't know how to modulate the clutch with the gas. They don't know how to do the brake and all that. That is one of the best examples for how we want to come out, is this smoothness. But when we're living with this untreated trauma, which is in the physiology,
Right.
will come out and the system will be like poof. And then that's where we feel this. Now, there's another set of traumas that are important to mention that surface around sleep, and that's when people who have had surgical trauma, namely anesthesia. So this is something I've had to work with a lot because I've had lots of anesthesias from my surgeries. My first surgery, I was 5. I had my tonsils out. It was a really horrific experience. Still remember it. Didn't like it. They're in the throat, so of course there's stuff going on with your breathing tubes. And so I've worked with really detailed stuff around my airway closing, right? And people get diagnosed with things like sleep apnea. And if you ask a lot of people, they'll say that they have had a surgical experience. They were put under and it was terrifying, or they couldn't breathe, or they woke up and something was in their throat, right? This happens so commonly, often, I should say. And so, because going under anesthesia and going under to sleep had the same physiological thing going on, the system is trying to recover and trying to heal that shock, because that is a shock, and then it gets diagnosed as something else. So I had to throw that in there because it's not enough to say, oh, it's because you had a horrible childhood. It could be because of something else that has nothing to do with unsafety in your life, but when you went into like a surgical arena and mom was, because back in the day, no one went with kids. There it wasn't nice. You were left, dropped off for a week, and that was it.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's terrifying for a little one. So that's the sleep thing. I don't know if that covers a few of them.
Well, I
Often,
think
yeah, go ahead,
I
please.
was going to say, I think what it really gets to is the unresolved trauma
Yes,
can come out in so many different ways.
yes.
And the red alert of the sympathetic nervous system, the shutdown.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It does. And I think, you asked a little while ago some stories. If I do general story, what often occurs when someone starts to heal at this deeper somatic, visceral nervous system level, and they really start to listen and work with their physiology and get to know it, because you have to get to know it. The more you get to know it, the more you feel. And the more you feel, the more you might not like what you feel. And that's actually a really common part of this kind of healing process, because you're excavating the old stuff that you did not have the maturity or the cognitive ability or the support to navigate and integrate. And so sleep is one of those things that I wish I could say to people: as soon as you start working on healing your traumas and you're just going to sleep like a baby, that's not necessarily true. That will happen, but it's like along that, it's like, again, the car example. Like, yes, you'll be able to navigate that stick shift, but it's going to be a little, you know, touch and go. And then you're going to get some really good smooth things. And then you're going to be in San Francisco on a hill. You're not going to know what to do. Right. And then you got to learn that. And so, one thing I'll often see is people will say, I'm not sleeping through the night, but when I am sleeping, it's better. Or I used to sleep like a log out, like the shutdown, and now I'm actually feeling anxiety at night and I don't like it. That is actually a good sign if someone's been in such shutdown. They just have to keep working with it, because eventually that will smooth out. But it's that underlying trauma physiology, the fight flight. When we've been in shutdown, it's going to come up and we're going to feel it, and then we're going to want to medicate it because it doesn't feel good. And that's where we have to be very attentive and aware of what we're feeling and why it's there.
Right.
Yeah.
When someone first learns about meditation and they're like, yeah, I used to be totally calm until I started meditating. And now I have.
It's true. And I actually did a great interview with a friend of mine and a colleague. His name is Chris Durkee's. The interview's on my YouTube channel. And he used to be a priest, actually, and now he's not. But he studied meditation in its purest form, like full-on Jesuit monastery monk.
Mhm.
And we were talking about it, and he gave me the history of all of it. You would really like the conversation, probably. And he said, back in the day, you couldn't just learn how to meditate on day one. It's like the Karate Kid thing, like you don't get to learn how to punch. First, you have to wax on, wax off for like a year. Back in
Right.
the day, it was like 20 years before you were allowed to get into that deep contemplative practice, because you had to build foundation.
Mhm.
You had to know how to feel sensation, know how to stay connected to the breath.
Right.
That meditative part didn't happen until you had all these skills. And so, what I'm seeing with a lot of folks is that when they go into these practices, mine as well, if there isn't, almost, it's not like, it's like a disclaimer almost, like things will come up,
Right.
and this is why, and it doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong, but it
Hmm.
just might mean that we need to put the training wheels on for a little longer before we do the deeper practices.
In the tradition that I study
Mhm,
into, very much we have to regulate our system.
mhm.
So that actually brings us back to
Yeah,
the inner critic and
right.
compassion and being safe for ourselves.
Mhm. Yeah, you asked that about that thinking, that kind of, we would call it negative thinking or critical. Shame is a big one, right? And that is actually an important piece when talking about addiction and dysregulation and depression and low self worth. And it's a big story, but recently I was talking in one of my videos about the origins of negative thoughts and where do they come from. And really, they don't come from us. They get perpetuated by us, but they come to us from something else. And the reason why is when we're born, we're not born with thoughts. We could, if you believe in the soul, we have a soul and we have a biology, basically. And how we learn is based on, it's the nurture nature piece. We learn based on how we're nurtured, and what we're given is what we know. So if we hear our parents talking poorly about other people, or poorly about themselves, or poorly to each other, or poorly to us, we take that on, and then that becomes our map of how we speak to others and ourselves. So that's the first thing, is like, how were we talked to when we were, it goes back to as young as when our diapers were being changed. People that have deep shame in their systems, if we could, and usually we can't do this because parents are usually gone and passed, or they're not connected because it was so horrible. But if you think about a baby that's being changed, we'll make it really simple, and they have lots of poopy, stinky, bowel movements coming out, and if the mother or the father or the caregiver is scringing their face in disgust, saying how stinky you are. Oh, that's terrible, putrid, disgusting. I got to get this off you. Even if it's in a funny tone, if there's that sense of ugh, when you're touching your child, that is one of the first entry points of them learning shame about their bodily functions and themselves. And we could guess how often that occurs, but it probably occurs pretty often. So there's the first hit against us feeling shitty about ourselves, no pun intended, right? And so, and then this idea of toxic shame, because there's a difference between toxic shame and healthy shame. Toxic shame is essentially, it's very different than guilt as well. So toxic shame is basically telling a child they're worthless, you're rotten, you don't know anything, you're stupid. And of course, why does a parent do that? Because they were probably given that too, and that's how they know how to talk. And it's a way of, basically punishing and speaking to that child, and then slowly over time, that toxic shaming becomes embodied. And I'm kind of slouching. You go into this posture of being small and minuscule, and it gets not only in the system but in the organs. Like the organs get to know how to be in that position. And so that's one thing that starts also this self critic, this negative talk, and this distaste, not necessarily always for us, but for what was given to us, right? So this sense of that wasn't nice, that wasn't right, but usually it was, so we're so young that we can't cognitively connect to it. Um, so that inner critic, from what I've seen, it starts that young with those sorts of interactions. And then of course there's school and how we're related to with our peers and all of that. Um, so from what I've seen, not only is it thought based, but we have to trace it. And I know that's you were saying that's the work you guys do, is getting into the somatic system. What's the posture doing? What are the cells doing? Um, and being able to let the person feel all of the emotions that come with that body posture. And one of the most the least talked about emotion, but it's one of the key human emotions, mammalian emotions, is disgust. And so that goes back to that example of the changing of the diapers, or saying to a kid, you're rotten. So it's not even about that kid being bad. They're basically, it's like, you're disgusting to me. How dare you do this to your sister, to the house, to your room? This is gross. And so that disgust gets carried with a person. And often we'll hear with folks who struggle, and I know I've worked with people, they feel disgusted with their actions. Like, I can't take care of myself. It's more than I'm a failure. Under that is this element of just, I suck at this, but it isn't cognitive typically. You trace it and you'll feel it somewhere in the system.
Deep in the
And
system.
yeah, and then you have to work with it and know, and to move that out is the work, a big part of the work. And
Mm.
that's complex and it takes time, but it can be, I've seen it shift and heal when we get to those deeper core physiological sensations that are emotions, if that makes sense.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a beautiful explanation of that. Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, let's move into some of the things that you do with
Hmm.
people, and we'll get some detail in a minute about how people can
Sure.
get a hold of you too. So people are in this situation, they have a lot of shame, they have some kind of addiction they're working
Yep.
with, they have unhealed trauma. So what are the kinds of things that you do?
I do a lot, but what
Mhm.
I tend to do as a first point with everyone is education. And the reason why that's so important, more than what we've even spoken about today, is because as humans, we have this higher brain up here that's very smart and analytical. If it knows the deeper aspects of our physiology, how it works, what these survival impulses are, the fight, flight, freeze, how these emotions get trapped in the system, things like the disgust and anger, and why anger is actually really important, and all of these things, knowing that from a deep level, it gives a person an upper hand, because then they know they can kind of check themselves and going, wait, this is not wrong. This is my body giving me a signal. I should listen to this. So I find that by just giving people practices off the bat, that can go south real fast, because if they don't know what might occur, they often will give up too soon. So education is number one. Melded into that, there's a lot of practices, but one of the more important ones is learning how to follow impulse. And I make a joke that it's not about the impulse to eat all the cookies in the cookie jar. That's a different kind of impulse. The impulses of our need to go to the bathroom, our need to rest, our need to drink something when our throat is dry, to stop eating, to listen when we're full. Um, the impulse of, I think I'm going to drive this way to pick up my kids today for whatever reason. I don't know why. I'm just, rather than, oh, this is how I go, I got to go this way. Um, so these impulses to me are just biological. As I mentioned at the very beginning of our talk, when we're little, they get trained out of us because of societal decencies. I mean, oh my goodness, the amount of people I've worked with, Lynn, who have horrific trauma around defecation and urination because they weren't allowed to go to the bathroom in kindergarten in grade 1, and then they peed their pants or they pooped their pants.
Yeah.
And then they're ridiculed. It's like I get shivers thinking about it,
Mm.
because it's this element of that kid knows it has to go.
Mhm.
And here we are telling this little immature creature, you can't, and they don't know how to hold it in at that age.
Right.
Right. But then you start to learn how to not let the biology do what it needs.
Mm.
Same with how we eat. We have to eat breakfast at 8, lunches at 12, dinners at 6. And when we're growing, ask any athlete. You can't eat that way if you're an athlete. You're eating like a lot more and at weird times because the body needs to refuel.
Mhm.
So getting back to this idea of how can we follow those biological impulses, it's a very sneaky way of learning how to listen to the insides
Mhm.
without, it's like it's too much to say, I want you to follow your sadness or something kind of obscure. If we can start with the biology,
Mhm.
often the next pieces fall into place.
Right, right. Mhm.
So anybody listening to that, just practice that for a month, and you might notice things start to change if you can just stick with that. And you'll see how trained we are to
Mhm.
not follow those impulses,
Mhm.
right? Whenever I teach my classes, one of the things we say to people at the beginning is like, if you have to go to the bathroom before our break, just go and don't and listen and feel if there's a part of you that feels bad, that
Mm.
feels like right? Like even watch that, because if you're sitting there holding in your urine trying to do a movement lesson, you're actually not doing the movement lesson. You're just holding in your urine and you're not going to get any benefit. So just go, come back, sure you're going to miss it and you're going to realize that you won't die if you leave, right? It's like
Right.
pause,
Yeah.
or if you're driving and you're trying to get somewhere, I don't want to stop. It's like just stop, right? Pull over, go to the gas station, even if it takes you an extra 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And then, so education, following the impulses is a big part. Um, I teach a massive amount of what we would call orienting. Are you familiar with that term at all?
Mhm.
So orienting is, I mean, I'm doing it right now. I'm looking outside of my window. I'm looking at a tree. I'm seeing the rain. I'm going to look at you. I can look at my cup with my tea. So in the natural world, an animal has two types of orienting responses. One is defensive and one is exploratory. Defensive is if there's that twig that snapped, we look. I mean,
Mhm.
you've got a dog. If it hears something coming down, what is
Oh,
that?
yeah.
Right? And when they're young, it's like it's like it's so exciting and I don't know what to do. I don't, and but as they learn, they're like, oh, and then they go back.
Right.
And so when we've had a lot of unsafety growing up, or if we've had a lot of accidents where stuff came from out of nowhere and we were shocked, our orienting responses are going to be a little faulty. They might be hyper vigilant, or they might be so turned off that we don't see something coming.
Right. Right.
And that is not only physical, but literal and energetic and metaphorical, that neuroception piece. So if
Yes.
we've had a lot of trauma and our orienting responses are not online, we either will be so hypervigilant that our lives are basically all about worrying about what's around us and who's around us, or we're so disconnected that we get into more accidents, or we
Right.
don't see that stranger or that danger coming towards us and then we get hurt again or we get attacked again.
Mhm.
So one of the things is restoring the orienting response to become natural and exploratory again. So that is where I would invite people to really look around and see things and just notice what is it like to actually take in the environment. And for some, it's a great practice, and others, it's terrifying, as simple as it might seem,
Mhm.
because they've never actually taken a moment to pause and really look. They know how to feel themselves, they know how to drop into their breath. But the
Mhm.
moment we say, can you do that and see around? It's like, that's impossible. So others, some can, some can't. And it doesn't mean that one is worse or bad or better or whatever. It's just, it depends on what our physiology was wired with from the beginning. So
And it's good
education.
to know that.
Yeah, and we do it naturally. Like if we go to the beach or to a park, we want to, people naturally look out. They look.
Mhm.
When we are stuck in that trauma and it's unresolved, we don't see the world in the same way,
Right.
because we wouldn't even think to look over there, because over there might have been dangerous a long time ago.
Mhm.
And that's where I kind of connect it with how we take care of our planet, actually. Because if we can't see the world around us, we're not going to take care of it.
Yeah.
And so that's so education following impulses, this idea of orienting and shifting that to have proper defense when needed, but for the most part using exploratory, which can be defense, right? When we cross the road, what are we supposed to do?
Mm-hmm.
We're supposed to look both ways. How
Right.
many people do we see now that don't do that anymore? It's shocking to me. People are looking at their phones, they're looking at the little green man flashing. They don't even think, maybe I should look left and right as I do this,
Right.
right? And then people get into these accidents that don't have to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so many things that we can see related to how we just interact with our environment that if we shift that a little bit, it brings us back into our physiology in a different way. And then the final thing, not that that's the final thing, the other thing that I do with my students a lot is teaching them how to work at the level of what I call the stress organs. So the organs in our body that mount a stress reaction when there's danger. And while the whole system can mount a reaction, I tend to focus mostly on the adrenals and the kidneys, because
Mm-hmm.
that's where adrenaline gets pumped out of the adrenal glands, but the kidneys get affected because it's right there. The gut. So there's a reason why kids, when there's not safe, get a tummy ache,
Mm-hmm.
right? Their tummies get, and adults too, like we feel it in our gut. So
Mm-hmm.
working with the gut and how it connects to everything, and then the brain stem, which is high up here, where the brain and the spinal cord meet. That is kind of like my example for that. If you think of a turtle, when it gets scared, or a snail, what does it do? It brings its head in.
Mm-hmm.
So humans have that same response, but we can't hide our head.
Right.
I never thought of it that way. But what happens is the brainstem, it gets tense and it tries to go up. And a lot of people will have these tensions up there
Mm-hmm.
that can cause a lot of trouble, because that part of the brainstem is where a lot of the rich nerves go into our spinal cord, and all of our cranial nerves go through, not all of them, but some of them. And so when that is tensed, um, it impacts the entire central nervous system, autonomic nervous system, and how we feel our bodies. So I help the students that I work with. It's almost like a guided meditation, but a little different, because we're looking at these organs and visualizing them and putting intention into them with often gentle movement, touch, to help them find safety again.
Oh. Hmm.
Yeah, and that work I learned not through Peter Levine, but through Kathy Kain, who works with the earlier traumas.
Mm-hmm.
Because when there was early trauma, you can't work verbally to heal it.
Right.
It
Mm-hmm.
has to be done from the pre-verbal somatic, because that little 1-year-old or 2-month-old or in utero old, all they know is sensation and somatic
Mm-hmm.
feeling.
Right.
It's not even feeling, it's not emotion, it's like gripping, pulling
Mm-hmm.
away from the umbilical cord, all these reactions from stress chemicals. And so to actually help that level of trauma, which we know equates to, we know this from the ACE study. I don't know if you've ever looked at the ACE study, to addiction, to chronic illness, to mental illness, arthritis, autoimmune. This early survival physiology, it starts 100% in the somatic system.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why, as you know, we're having to work with the body to work at these levels, because the cognition is too advanced for the primitive nature that the system is working at, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
that is a small little nutshell.
Right. Right. And there are a lot of free resources that people
Yeah.
can access as well. So why don't we get into your website, and what's the best way for people to get a hold of you?
Yeah, the best way is just my name. You just type in Irene Lyon, a lion with a Y, it'll pop up. And when you're there, it's like any website. You've got my history. I have a blog. it goes all social media. I've got a really extensive YouTube channel, hundreds of videos, and a lot of ebooks and audio samplers. There's a really good training that's, again, free, called Healing Trauma,
Hmm.
three-part series. It goes deeper into the science. And then I've got 3 things that I do that are paid, of the paid nature. So 2 online courses and a workshop that is more movement, more Feldenkrais, more games,
Hmm.
Eastern medicine, getting people into their bodies in that kind of more social engagement regulation based way. So it's all there, easy to find.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much. So before we go,
You're
though, do you
welcome.
have one last piece of advice, or what would
Mhm.
you say to someone who's really wanting to heal, starting to really recognize that they've got some unhealed trauma,
Mhm.
maybe some addiction?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'll say is we're all in this together.
Mm.
So even though someone might be solo on their own, if you can connect to the greater globe, whether it's us, whether it's this summit, whether it's just knowing that there are definitely others in the exact same boat, because there are. As I
Mhm.
mentioned at the very start of this call, we're all in this situation where we're uncovering, oh my God, we haven't worked on this stuff at this level.
Mhm.
So that's the first thing. And then the second thing would be something a little different. And I want everyone to know that they can heal, because everyone can.
Right. Mhm.
The caveat to that, or the sidebar that I think is equally important and should go to the top, and this comes back to the shame elements, is we have to believe that we deserve to heal.
Mhm.
And deserving is really important, because if we don't actively feel that we deserve to get better, we will find ways to keep throwing ourselves off the path, whether it's through excuses, sabotaging, picking a fight. Like there's all these ways as humans that we sneakily throw ourselves off. I found that with my students, when they not only believe they can heal, but they deserve it. Like, I deserve this.
Mhm.
And I wasn't given that opportunity when I was young, and now I'm an adult. And
Mhm.
I'm going to assume everyone watching this is relatively adult. We
Mhm.
need to be like adults and be like, you know what, that all happened. It was horrible. And let's move forward and deserve it and do all the steps that are necessary to make that happen.
Right.
And if I could add one more thing, you said one, it's to really also feel how we are all connected. I know I just said that, but when we work on our stuff, it contributes to the greater good of the entire planet. And I
Mhm.
firmly believe that.
Mhm.
We have billions and billions of cells in our body. The health of the cell creates the health of the system. The billions of humans on this planet create the world and the energy. And so when we are not working on our stuff, it's going to sound bad, but we're contributing to it not healing. Doesn't mean that we have to fix it all in a week, because that's not possible, but just little tiny things. Like I said, listening to when you need to go to the bathroom and honoring that. As crazy as that sounds, that's contributing to the greater good of humanity, I believe, because you're
Mhm.
not holding anything in, literally and
Right.
energetically. You're letting your system have what it needs. And the more we can do that, the more we can do that for others. And
Yeah.
it ripples out. I firmly believe that. So
Mm.
those are my 3 pieces.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. You're
This has
so
been so
welcome.
interesting. Yes. Thanks so much for coming on and for sharing what you do.
Of
And
course.
I would just highly recommend for people to check out your
Mm,
resources and listen to some of your YouTubes, and to
yeah.
educate people about how it works is really so helpful in letting go of the shame.
Yes, get the education on, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lynn.
Well, thank you. Hello, this is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center Radical Recovery Summit. We are so excited to bring you the lineup for January 10th to 19th, 2020. Go to radicalrecoverysummit.com to see the new headliners for 2020 and to sign up. You can watch free January 10th to 19th or buy an all access pass.